The peaceful morning in Atlanta had just begun, with gentle sunlight filtering through the rows of trees along the street, casting a warm glow over the gradually bustling city. Cynthia Nixon, an experienced police officer with 15 years of service in the Atlanta Police Department, stepped out of a sleek silver rental car in front of Maggie's diner. Today, Cynthia had opted for a rental because her car was in the shop. The brand new, polished vehicle seemed to reflect her calm mood, blending quietly into the surroundings. Cynthia took a deep breath, savoring this rare moment of tranquility, her mind still briefly lingering on what had happened the previous night. It had been a successful operation, dismantling a drug trafficking ring threatening her community. Missions like this reminded her why she had joined the police force. But for now, she just wanted to enjoy a quiet morning at the small diner, where the coffee was always aromatic, the biscuits soft and warm, and the regular patrons greeted her like family. As she stepped out of the car, the smell of freshly baked goods wafted through the air, relaxing her as a soft smile crossed her lips. However, she had only taken a few steps when the sound of a police car engine pulled into the parking lot. The harsh screech of brakes made her turn around just in time to see a young officer getting out of his vehicle, his expression tense and stony. He looked like a rookie, still new to the field, but there was a coldness and determination in his gaze that made her uneasy. Cynthia raised her hand in a friendly gesture, hoping to ease the tension she sensed, but the officer did not respond. Instead, he quickened his pace towards her, his gaze fixed with an unsettling intensity. She quickly glanced at the nameplate on his uniform. Dennis. The name vaguely rang a bell. He seemed to be one of the recruits who had recently joined the force. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle immediately," he commanded, his voice filled with authority and aggressiveness that seemed excessive for a simple greeting. Cynthia frowned, perplexed. She wasn't on duty, was dressed in civilian clothes, and was nowhere near any crime scene. Why was this happening? She felt a twinge of irritation but kept her tone calm and composed. "Excuse me, officer," she said evenly, her voice tinged with restrained frustration. "What is the issue here?" "You resemble a suspect we're looking for," Dennis replied, his gaze glancing dismissively over her documents. A chill ran down Cynthia's spine at his words. This wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken due to her appearance, but she had never imagined it could happen within her community, especially after dedicating so many years to her work. Maintaining her composure, Cynthia reached into her bag and pulled out her driver's license, holding it out in front of him. "I'm Captain Cynthia Nixon with the Atlanta Police Department. Perhaps you should verify my information before going any further, Officer Dennis." She hoped her firm, calm tone would give him pause and prompt him to check. But Dennis only glanced at the ID with indifference, his face growing even colder. "Impersonating a rank won't work here. We don't give special treatment to anyone," he sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Cynthia's heart raced, a mixture of anger and disbelief swelling inside her. Years of dedication, training officers like him, and in just a moment, all of her accomplishments were being ignored as if they had never existed. Cynthia tried not to let her growing frustration and shock show. After so many years in the field, she was well-versed in remaining calm under pressure. But this was a situation she had never anticipated. A moment where her fellow officer didn't respect the truth or her identity. With a steady voice, she repeated, "Officer Dennis, this is a serious mistake. You need to verify my information immediately. I don't want this situation to escalate." Dennis chuckled, the sarcasm in his eyes even more pronounced. "A serious mistake?" he scoffed. "I don't care who you say you are. Here, I'm in charge and I'll handle this like any other case." His tone was icy, unwavering, his hand ready on his handcuffs. "Don't think throwing a title around is going to make any difference." Cynthia took a deep breath, trying once more to keep her composure. "I don't need special treatment, officer. I'm simply asking you to follow protocol, and that includes verifying information before making any decisions." She looked directly at him, her gaze steady and assertive. "This will have consequences if you don't check my credentials, and I'm saying this for both our benefit." But Dennis remained unmoved. His gaze became even more unyielding, as though his arrogance intensified with Cynthia's attempts to reason with him. "Do you think you're here to lecture me? I've dealt with people like you before. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately," he said, his tone sharp and unforgiving. His expression, posture, and voice all radiated a rigid arrogance. Cynthia felt the cold touch of Dennis's cuffs on her wrists, and that sensation ignited the anger within her, but she remained outwardly composed. "Dennis, I'm not lecturing. This is a serious warning. If you fail to verify my identity, you'll be facing professional consequences. This isn't about me, it's about protocol and the fairness we're all committed to." Dennis took a deep breath, as if steadying himself, then leaned close to Cynthia, his gaze defiant and unyielding. "I don't need anyone to remind me about fairness, especially not from an impersonator." He held her wrist firmly, pulling her closer, his actions marked by an unmistakable sense of power. At this moment, Cynthia knew any attempt at reason was futile. She felt not only frustration, but also deep disappointment that a colleague would act with such injustice and rigidity. Dennis's blind arrogance had reduced all her achievements and hard work to nothing in a single moment. "Dennis, this is my final warning. If you cuff me without checking my credentials, you'll be responsible. This is no longer a misunderstanding. It's a violation of my rights," Cynthia said, her tone firm and unwavering. But she knew she was going to be cuffed, as Dennis's ego and inflexibility seemed to have overshadowed all reason and protocol. Without further hesitation, Dennis stated, "Turn around and don't say another word." He swiftly locked Cynthia's hands, tightening the cuffs with a forceful motion, as if asserting his authority. Humiliation and pain coursed through every part of Cynthia's body, not just because of the cold metal cuffs, but also because of the stares from the crowd. Eyes filled with doubt, curiosity, and even a hint of pity. Cynthia's heart pounded, a wave of shock sinking into her very core. As a veteran police officer, she had seen scenes like this from the outside countless times, but never did she imagine she would be the central figure in such a humiliating situation. "Officer Dennis, I am not resisting, but I request that you confirm my identity," Cynthia said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed her tension. She had been in this field long enough to know that any strong reaction on her part could escalate the situation. Yet her patience and restraint did not affect Dennis's hardened stance. Instead of listening, he narrowed his eyes, his face set as if he had already made up his mind. "I already told you. Turn around and stay quiet," Dennis barked, his tone harsh, tinged with a strange hostility. He led her through the growing crowd, which was beginning to murmur. Some had even pulled out their phones, recording the scene. A black woman in a simple attire, handcuffed and being escorted toward the patrol car. Cynthia felt every gaze upon her, a wave of shame surging within as she realized she, a person of authority, was now being treated like a criminal in broad daylight. Disappointment and frustration overwhelmed Cynthia as she thought of the years she had devoted to the police force, the countless nights spent handling complex cases, and the hours spent training young officers. She had once stood where Dennis was, a young officer eager to prove herself, but she couldn't understand how her colleague could lack empathy to this extent. She had sacrificed so much to reach her current position, to pave the way for other women of color in the force. And now, due to one subjective judgment, all her achievements and dignity were being disregarded. While Cynthia bit her lip to control her emotions, Dennis seemed oblivious to her pain and distress. In his eyes, she was merely a suspect, someone to be controlled with authority and force. Dennis had been rigorously trained to keep a cool head, not to let anyone, especially those he deemed suspicious, sway his judgment. Yet within that cold detachment was an intense desire to prove himself as the best, as an officer who enforced the law without compromise. Years of training and pressure had shaped Dennis's rigid mindset. In his mind, a suspect needed to be subdued and had to submit entirely to the police. Now the woman in front of him, regardless of what she said, was nothing more than a suspicious individual. Dennis didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to know, that his cold judgment could wound not just one person, but also erode the trust and honor of an entire community. "This is unnecessary, Officer Dennis," Cynthia said, her gaze firm yet controlled, her voice steady though each word carried deep anger. "You're making a serious mistake." But Dennis remained silent, tightening his grip on her wrists and pulling her toward the patrol car. Cynthia's words, along with the reality of her identity and rank, seemed to be mere echoes that didn't register in his mind. He led her to the car with a determined expression, as if fulfilling some noble duty, showing no hesitation or doubt. To him, handcuffing this woman was just another part of his job, a testament to his dedication to duty. Cynthia walked silently, but her mind roiled with humiliation and rage. She knew that this silence would leave a scar not only on her, but on every onlooker, who would remember this scene as a stark reminder of the irrational biases still present in society. Cynthia sat quietly in the back seat of the patrol car, her gaze vacant as she looked out the window while the car drove back to headquarters. Each jolt as the vehicle hit, a bump felt like a painful reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. She, a police officer with 15 years of experience, was now handcuffed and being escorted like a criminal. The curious stares, the raised phones capturing every moment, it all left a deep wound, not only in her pride but also in her trust in her colleagues. When the car stopped in front of headquarters, Officer Dennis got out, firmly gripping Cynthia's arm as he led her inside. Whispers began to ripple through the building as her colleagues stopped to stare, many of them visibly shocked to see Cynthia, a person they respected, handcuffed. Some couldn't hide the anger and disbelief in their faces. Sergeant Samuel, a longtime colleague and close friend of Cynthia, rushed over. "Captain Nixon," he exclaimed, his voice thick with indignation and disbelief. His gaze turned sharply toward Dennis, his expression filled with disapproval. Samuel had known Cynthia long enough to understand that she would never deserve such treatment. "What the hell is going on here?" Dennis, though starting to look uneasy, maintained a stiff expression. "This woman matches the description of a suspect we're looking for," he said, trying to keep his voice cold, though he was visibly shaken. Samuel could hardly believe what he was hearing. "She's not just some woman. This is Captain Cynthia Nixon, your superior. She's the highest-ranking officer in this entire precinct." Dennis froze as if the full weight of his actions was finally sinking in. The confidence and resolve he had displayed moments earlier began to crumble, replaced by embarrassment and shame. He glanced around, noticing the judging, disapproving stares from his colleagues. He had always thought he could maintain composure, but this situation was making him more unsettled than he'd ever felt. At that moment, Chief Christian appeared in the doorway, his piercing gaze sweeping through the crowd and stopping at Cynthia, still handcuffed. Recognizing the undeniable error in this situation, he approached Dennis, his tone harsh and controlled. "Dennis, in my office, now." The short, firm command carried an undercurrent of anger that everyone could feel. Dennis bowed his head, face flushed, and followed Chief Christian into the office in silence, leaving Cynthia amid the sympathetic and disapproving looks of her colleagues. Samuel quickly stepped forward to unlock her cuffs, his hands trembling slightly as he did, as though he too felt a shared sense of shame and humiliation on her behalf. "I'm so sorry, Captain. This should never have happened," he said quietly, his voice full of empathy. Cynthia took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "It's all right, Samuel, but this will have to be addressed," she replied, her eyes steely with determination. A moment later, the office door opened, and Dennis emerged, his face etched with remorse. He walked over to Cynthia, his gaze lowered, and after a brief hesitation, he looked up at her, speaking in a halting, apologetic tone. "Captain Nixon, I apologize for my thoughtless and unfair actions," Dennis said, his voice strained. "I was wrong not to verify your identity, and I should never have let my ego and rigidity override my duty. I failed in my responsibilities, and I deeply regret it." Cynthia was silent for a moment, her gaze steady on Dennis. She still felt anger, but she also recognized that this apology was a difficult step for someone like Dennis, a person who had always been self-assured and prideful. She understood that Chief Christian's intervention had been a harsh awakening for him, forcing him to confront his misconduct. "Dennis, I appreciate your apology," Cynthia replied, her tone calm yet sharp. "But I hope you understand the responsibility that comes with situations like this. The authority we have is never to be used to impose on or harm others, especially when we haven't even verified the facts." Dennis nodded, his face still flushed with embarrassment. "I understand, Captain. I promise this will never happen again." Cynthia gave a slight nod, accepting his apology but keeping her expression firm. "I hope so, Dennis, but this won't end with an apology. I'll be reporting this incident to ensure no one else has to go through what I went through today." Dennis nodded slightly, his shame and regret evident. Cynthia's words served as a reminder that his mistake would not be easily forgotten. He turned to walk away, fully aware that he now had to face the consequences of the arrogance and injustice he had inflicted. Cynthia took a deep breath, looking around at her colleagues, sensing both empathy and encouragement in their gazes. She knew that she had stood up for justice, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever endured unfair treatment in this environment. Following the incident, Chief Christian called an emergency meeting with the entire team, not only to clarify the serious error Dennis had made, but also to address broader issues of bias and awareness within the precinct. Cynthia entered the meeting room, the air heavy with tension. She requested that Dennis be held accountable for his actions and undergo bias training to ensure that no officer would judge others solely on appearances or personal prejudice. However, her request wasn't met with unanimous support. As soon as she made her proposal, several older officers began to show signs of dissatisfaction, arguing that it was an excessive and unfair measure for Dennis. They argued that he had merely made a minor mistake, that he was inexperienced, and that bias training was unnecessary over one error in a tense situation. One officer stood up, his voice filled with objection. "Captain Nixon, not all of us need to go through that kind of training. Dennis just made a mistake while on duty. We can't force him into comprehensive training just because of one incident." His words only heightened the tension in the room. Cynthia looked around, noting a few other colleagues who were silent but unsupportive. To them, the reforms Cynthia was proposing seemed to challenge the traditions and long-standing practices within the department. They believed she was complicating matters and imposing new ideas on the team unnecessarily. Cynthia took a deep breath, sensing the scrutinizing and reserved gazes from her colleagues. She stood up, her voice echoing through the silence in the room. "This is not just about me or Officer Dennis. This is about our approach to our work, about the trust and respect we need to build with the community. We can't expect the public to trust us if we're not committed to self-reflection and improvement. This isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity for us to become better." Chief Christian sat silently, observing with a shameful expression. He understood that Cynthia was right and recognized the importance of bias training. He spoke up to settle the matter. "To create a fair workplace and better serve our community, we must be accountable for our actions. Dennis will participate in this training, and I hope everyone understands that this is for the greater good, not a personal criticism." A few officers still looked displeased, but Christian's gaze silenced them. The room fell into a tense quiet. Cynthia realized that her battle wasn't just with Officer Dennis, but with the conservative mindset and resistance to change among some of her colleagues. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she couldn't back down, because this change wasn't just for her. It was for the community she had sworn to protect. After the meeting, Cynthia entered Chief Christian's office, where he was already waiting, his expression thoughtful as she walked in. Christian gestured for her to sit and close the door, creating a quiet space for them to discuss openly what had just transpired and the path forward. Christian regarded Cynthia for a moment, his face serious yet filled with understanding. "Cynthia," he began, "I know this incident has been a shock for all of us, especially for you. But changing something that's so deeply ingrained in the way people operate here is no simple task. It's clear to me that we need a different approach if we want to rebuild trust within this team." Cynthia nodded slightly, her gaze sharp but full of determination. "Exactly, Chief. I realize this issue isn't solely Dennis's fault. The problem lies in the rigid thinking and unconscious bias that many of us carry. This won't change unless we implement a comprehensive training program that helps officers understand the importance of eliminating bias, not just in their work, but in the way they view people as a whole." Christian listened intently and then sighed quietly. "I understand your point, but I have to emphasize that a lot of officers here have been with the department for decades. Some may not even recognize their own biases. Requiring them to participate in this training might make them feel insulted or like their years of experience are being disregarded." Cynthia responded calmly. "I understand, Chief, but the issue is that if we continue to overlook these mistakes, we won't progress. The public has placed their trust in us, and we can't allow unconscious bias to erode that trust. We need to acknowledge that bias can exist in anyone, even those who have been in this field for a long time." Christian fell silent, clearly empathizing with Cynthia's resolve, but also concerned about the team's reaction. "You know, Cynthia, there may be people who won't agree with this plan, and I fear it could lead to unnecessary internal tensions." "Yes, Chief, I'm prepared for that," Cynthia replied, her voice unwavering. "But if we're unwilling to face this challenge, we'll never achieve real change. And that change is essential, not just for the police department, but for the community we serve. Christian nodded slowly, looking deeply into Cynthia's eyes as if searching for assurance. All right, Cynthia, I trust you. You have full authority to design this program, and I'll be here to support you. But be prepared for the obstacles ahead. What you're about to do won't be easy. Cynthia smiled slightly, gratitude filling her heart at Christian's support. She understood that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But with this shared resolve, she believed she could begin laying a new foundation for the department. The first training session began in a tense atmosphere as Cynthia stepped into the room, facing a sea of wary and resistant faces. She could feel the tension radiating throughout the room. Some officers sat with their arms crossed, gazing around indifferently as if to signal they had no interest in what was about to unfold. Others, especially the seasoned veterans, held rigid expressions, quietly challenging any changes that might threaten the principles and practices they'd upheld for years. Cynthia opened by outlining the goals of the training. She emphasized that this wasn't about criticizing anyone, but about recognizing how biases could subtly influence daily decisions. We're here to discuss how each decision we make can deeply impact others' lives, Cynthia said calmly, her voice steady yet powerful. As officers, our duty is not only to protect, but to treat everyone with fairness and respect. She divided the officers into small groups, assigning each one a scenario to discuss. The situations were carefully crafted from real-life cases, encouraging officers to reflect on and reconsider their responses. But as soon as the group started, Cynthia noticed the first signs of resistance. In one group, two senior officers, Bill and Marcus, openly showed their reluctance. Bill muttered to Marcus, loud enough for Cynthia to overhear, "This is a waste of time. We've been doing this for decades. We don't need anyone telling us how to treat people." A few officers quietly nodded in agreement, some checking their watches, clearly hoping the training would end quickly. Cynthia observed silently, sensing the skepticism and apathy in the room. Nevertheless, she persisted, moving among the groups and encouraging officers to share their thoughts. But not everyone was willing to open up, and some merely went through the motions because they felt obligated to participate. The first scenario involved a young man who was stopped for looking like a suspect. Cynthia asked the officers to discuss how they would handle this situation, but many dismissed it as familiar and not worth analyzing. One officer remarked, "If he's innocent, a quick check doesn't hurt. We're just doing our job." At this, Cynthia decided to intervene. She approached the group and said, "We might think a simple check is harmless, but remember that each time someone is stopped based only on appearance, it leaves them with feelings of distrust and disappointment. We need to understand that bias can damage the trust we're working to build with the community." Immediately, Marcus, a respected senior officer, stood up, his face revealing clear disapproval. "Captain Nixon," he began, his voice dry, "I don't see why these training sessions are necessary. I've served for over 30 years, and no one has ever complained about my treatment. We all have our methods to work effectively, and I don't see a need to change that." Cynthia kept her composure, meeting Marcus's gaze with calm determination. "Marcus, I don't doubt your dedication and professionalism, but experience doesn't make us immune to mistakes. I've been misjudged myself, and you know, an experience like that doesn't just affect the individual, it harms the entire community." A silence settled over the room. Some officers seemed to be reconsidering her words, though a sense of hesitation lingered, especially among veterans like Marcus, who saw this as a challenge to their long-held practices. Cynthia continued introducing exercises, each one prompting the officers to discuss challenging situations and consider how unconscious biases might affect their choices. One particular scenario involved an immigrant family being stopped and questioned simply because they didn't speak English. She asked the officers to reflect on how that family might feel and consider how they could handle the situation better. Dennis, who had once handcuffed Cynthia in a case of mistaken identity, initially sat quietly, his expression tense. But as he listened to the stories of younger officers, he began to reflect. When Cynthia invited him to speak, Dennis paused, his eyes betraying a hint of remorse. "Honestly, I never thought I had any bias," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "But after what happened with Captain Nixon, I realized that sometimes we act on instinct without understanding the consequences." Cynthia gave him a gentle smile, her gaze empathetic. "Dennis, Recognizing and admitting our mistakes is difficult, but it's the first step toward growth. Bias is something that exists unconsciously in all of us, and only when we confront it can we become fair officers. Gradually, through each exercise and conversation, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Officers started listening and sharing more openly. Personal stories emerged, times when they realized bias had influenced their decisions, creating an environment of openness and empathy. A young officer named Jake shared that he had once acted unfairly toward a group of teenagers simply because their clothing seemed suspicious. Looking back, Jake said, I realize I judged them based on appearances, and that was wrong. Without this training, I probably wouldn't have noticed that. Jake's story prompted many others to think deeply. They began to see that Cynthia wasn't imposing anything on them, but was offering an opportunity for self-reflection and a better understanding of their responsibility to the community. For Cynthia, each small change from every officer represented a significant step forward in building trust and fairness. The session extended longer than expected as officers began to open up, listen, and engage with each other. By the end of the training, Cynthia looked around the room and sensed a different atmosphere from when they'd started. Faces that had been cold and tense had softened, and the officers' gazes were now more reflective. Dennis approached Cynthia, his eyes full of emotion. Thank you, Captain. Today I learned a lot. I'm committed to making changes, not just for myself, but for the community we serve. Cynthia smiled softly, feeling a renewed faith in the possibility of change. She knew that the road ahead was still filled with challenges, but with these small steps, she believed that their police department could grow stronger and better for everyone involved. After the tense yet hopeful first training session, Cynthia knew that changing internal mindsets was only part of the journey. To truly build trust between the police and the community, she needed to create an open space where people could directly share their experiences and concerns. So Cynthia organized a meeting with community leaders and residents, inviting all officers to listen to the stories of the people they served every day. The community meeting took place in the late afternoon at the Cultural Center's main hall. Cynthia prepared carefully for the event, intending not only for the police department to listen, but for the residents to finally voice their stories and feelings, some of which they had likely kept hidden for years. She wanted everyone to understand that this was an opportunity to begin the healing process, a place for police and community members to sit together openly without fear of judgment. When Cynthia entered the room, she saw a wide range of residents. There were elderly citizens, young families with children, and even teenagers, the latter being people she knew might be growing up with skepticism toward the police. Alongside them were police officers, including some who had initially doubted the value of the reform she was trying to implement. Some of the senior officers appeared reserved, perhaps even nervous, as they had never faced the community in this way before. But Cynthia had insisted that all officers participate because she believed that real change could only happen when everyone genuinely listened. Cynthia began the meeting with a sincere thank you to everyone for attending. She didn't want this to feel like a formal assembly. Instead, she envisioned it as a sharing session where people could speak their minds freely, without interruption or judgment. Everyone here has a story, and today we are here to listen, Cynthia said, her voice warm yet serious. We want to understand what you've gone through, the fears, the losses, and the disappointments that may have shaken your trust in us. We're not here to make excuses, but to acknowledge that mistakes have been made, and it is our responsibility to make things right. A heavy silence filled the room as the residents looked at each other, many hesitant, unsure if they should open up. But then a middle-aged woman, tired yet with a determined look in her eyes, slowly stood up. She introduced herself as Linda, a resident of the neighborhood for over 30 years, who had witnessed many changes, both good and bad. When I was young, the police were a symbol of protection, Linda began, her voice trembling with emotion. But over time, I saw incidents that made us lose faith. A few years ago, my son, who was only 16 at the time, was stopped just because he looked like a suspect. No evidence, no valid reason, just because he had curly hair and wore a shirt that didn't look respectable to them. Her voice cracked, her eyes welling up as she recalled the painful memory. Since that day, my son hasn't trusted the police. Every time he sees a patrol car, he turns away, unable to look directly. And I wonder, how can I tell him the police are good when he's been treated this way? Linda's story left the hall in silence. Many officers looked down, their expressions reflecting guilt and regret. These weren't distant stories from the news, but real experiences from their neighbors. People they had thought they were protecting. Her words forced them to confront the harsh reality of the harm that thoughtless actions could cause. As whispers spread among the residents, an older man named Reverend James, a respected local pastor, rose to speak. He slowly looked around the room, his gaze warm yet resolute. "The children in this neighborhood are growing up with a different reality," he said, his voice steady and powerful. "I often hear them speak about the police, not with respect, but with fear. They no longer see officers as protectors, but as people who might get them into trouble without reason. I've seen parents shed tears when their children come home terrified after being stopped for no apparent reason." Reverend James paused, his voice growing more emotional. "I'm not here to criticize, but I want to emphasize that even small actions can have a profound impact on a child's life. Every time we see a child fear the police, we feel a piece of trust has been lost. But we're here today because we hope to restore that trust." Reverend James's words deepened the silence in the room. Some officers began to bow their heads in thought, and a few sighed quietly, realizing that their actions might have left lasting scars on those they were meant to serve. Among them, Dennis sat motionless, his face filled with regret. He remembered the incident with Cynthia, handcuffing her and treating her as a suspect. It felt as though Linda's and Reverend James's words were directed straight at him. His heart swelled with remorse, and he knew he couldn't remain silent. Dennis stood up, his eyes red as he looked toward Linda and Reverend James. "I can't change what happened, and I know I've caused harm to people I thought I was protecting," he said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I didn't realize how my actions could cause such pain. From today, I commit to changing, to learning and listening more." The room was silent, charged with emotion. The residents looked at Dennis, some still uncertain, but slowly their expressions softened with understanding. Dennis's public apology was a rare gesture, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing not just to soothe but as a promise for a better future. Reverend James approached Dennis, placing a hand on his shoulder with a forgiving gaze. "You have a chance now to do the right thing," he said, his voice low and warm. "We're willing to open our hearts if you're truly committed to change. This isn't just a promise to us, but a commitment to yourself." More residents began to share their stories. One man spoke about his daughter being followed because of her minority background, and another woman described the fear of calling the police, worried she would be judged or mistreated. Each story was filled with emotion, providing the officers with a raw and honest perspective on how each action, no matter how small, could have a lasting impact. The meeting concluded with handshakes and looks of understanding between residents and officers. Cynthia stood quietly in a corner, observing the scene with a full heart, overwhelmed by both emotion and hope. She knew that while the path ahead was long and filled with challenges, this meeting had laid the foundation for a new future, one where police and community could build a fairer, more respectful society together. With the stories she'd heard and the commitments made, Cynthia felt she had made significant progress in healing the long-standing wounds between the police and the community. She knew setbacks would come, but moments like these motivated her to keep pushing forward toward her ultimate goal, a community where the police were not just enforcers of the law, but true allies and protectors for everyone. After the deeply moving community meeting, Cynthia felt that the changes she had initiated within the police department were beginning to make a broader impact. She could see a shift, not only in the attitudes, but also in the actions of her officers, many of whom had once been skeptical or even dismissive of her reforms. Now they were becoming more open and active in their efforts to connect with the community. To foster the healing process, Cynthia organized more hands-on activities, where officers would volunteer at local events, engage with residents, and even help coordinate community gatherings. She believed that only through direct contact and genuine listening would they truly grasp the depth of their responsibility to protect and serve the community. In the first week, officers, including Dennis and Marcus, both of whom had initially resisted reform, agreed to participate in a charity fair in the neighborhood. At first, some residents looked at the officers with wary eyes, avoiding them to prevent any interaction. However, the officers stood patiently, gently greeting those who were willing to listen. They didn't merely stand there as law enforcers. They blended into the festive atmosphere, helping with booths, organizing games for children, and handing out food to attendees. A memorable moment occurred when Dennis, who had once wrongfully detained Cynthia, noticed a group of teenagers gathered in a corner of the fair, casting doubtful glances at the officers. Dennis decided to approach them, greeting them, starting a conversation about his work, the challenges he faced, and openly acknowledging the mistakes he had made. He admitted that he understood why so many young people in the neighborhood didn't trust the police and promised he would work hard to mend the harm he and his colleagues had caused. Initially, the teenagers responded with brief, reserved answers, their eyes still guarded. But gradually, as Dennis continued speaking with sincerity, one boy named Malik mustered the courage to ask, "You say you want to change, but how do we know you're doing it? We've heard promises before." Malik's direct question made Dennis pause, but he met the boy's gaze and replied, "You don't have to believe my words, but I want you to watch me, see how I work, and if I ever let you down, don't hesitate to tell me." Dennis's words seemed to build a bit of trust in Malik and his friends. They began opening up more, sharing stories of times when they felt unfairly treated because of their appearance or background. Dennis listened intently, realizing that their feelings echoed those of many residents. By the end of the fair, Dennis saw the teenagers smile and nod at him as they left. For Dennis, it was a small but deeply meaningful step toward rebuilding trust. Along with community events, Cynthia encouraged officers to engage in friendly patrols, where they would stop to talk with residents instead of solely focusing on monitoring. One evening, Marcus, a senior and traditionally conservative officer, went on a patrol with a young recruit. They stopped along the way to chat with elderly residents about their lives and listen to the stories of families who had lived there for generations. In a moment of reflection, Marcus realized that while many residents had seen him patrolling over the years, they'd never truly known each other. When one resident asked him about the sudden change in approach, Marcus responded honestly, admitting that he used to think following the rules was enough, but now he understood that it wasn't sufficient to build a lasting relationship with the community. However, not everything went smoothly. While Cynthia and the officers received a great deal of positive feedback, they also faced criticism. Some residents still doubted the sincerity of the officers, viewing these efforts as mere showmanship to improve the department's image. A few even held separate community meetings to voice their disapproval, calling the police's actions performative and insincere. At one community event, an elderly resident publicly challenged Cynthia, saying, "You can hold as many meetings as you want, but to me, the police are still the police. We've been hurt too many times to trust again just because of a few apologies." His gaze filled with resentment. Cynthia stood there, listening silently, without interrupting or arguing. She understood that his words were not just expressions of anger, but were rooted in real experiences shared by many in the community who had lost faith long ago. After that evening, several officers expressed frustration and exhaustion. "We're doing all of this, but they still don't want to trust us," one officer said, disheartened, during a meeting with Cynthia. "I'm starting to feel like this is all for nothing." Cynthia looked around the room thoughtfully before speaking, her voice filled with both empathy and resolve. "I understand how you feel. Change is never easy, and it certainly won't happen overnight. We can't erase the past, but we can create a different present. Don't let criticism discourage you, because every small action we take matters. Be patient, keep listening, and keep working. This is our responsibility and our commitment to the community." Cynthia's words renewed a sense of purpose among the officers. Despite the challenges and public skepticism, they felt a reason to keep trying. They continued volunteering at events, engaging with residents, and spending time learning about the genuine concerns and needs of each family in the neighborhood. One of the most touching moments came when Linda, the woman who had once shared her story about her son's fear of the police, met Dennis again at a community gathering. She approached him, her eyes filled with emotion and hope. "Officer Dennis," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "my son has noticed what you and your colleagues have been doing. He told me that maybe, just maybe, he might give the police another chance." Linda's words felt like a cool breeze to Dennis, reassuring him that his efforts and persistence hadn't been in vain. It wasn't just the acknowledgement of one mother, it was the hope of a new generation, a generation that might grow up with a sense of trust in those who were meant to protect them. From a distance, Cynthia watched the scene unfold, feeling a swell of joy and pride. She knew that the journey ahead was still long and would undoubtedly present more challenges. But each small step forward, each smile, each sincere thank you from a resident was proof that change was beginning to take root. She believed that her department, despite needing to overcome lingering biases and skepticism, was steadily moving toward its ultimate goal, becoming a police force that was fair, compassionate, and truly trusted by the community. Several months after Cynthia's reform program began, she received an invitation from a local high school to speak to students about the work of the police and the importance of change within the community. She saw this as an opportunity to not only discuss the reforms she was implementing, but also to build trust with the younger generation, the ones who would shape the future and play a vital role in mending the relationship between police and the public. As Cynthia entered the auditorium, the students watched her silently, their eyes a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She could sense that many of them had heard about the mistakes made by the police force and likely carried big questions about the responsibilities of law enforcement. Cynthia knew that to earn their trust, she would need to be completely genuine. She began her speech by talking about the core principles every officer should hold: fairness, loyalty to the community, and a strong sense of responsibility. Cynthia shared stories of the challenges she and her officers had faced, about the mistakes of the past and the relentless efforts to make amends. She spoke of perseverance in the inner change that she believed could create a police force truly dedicated to the community. "Our job is not just to patrol the streets or maintain order," Cynthia said, her voice warm yet resolute. "We have to protect people and uphold the trust of the community. I know that in the past there were times when we let people down, and I also know that rebuilding trust is no easy feat. But we are here today to show you that you can believe in the police once again." She paused, scanning the faces of the students in front of her. Many listened attentively, while others remained skeptical. Suddenly, a boy stood up, his gaze steady but filled with doubt. "Ms. Nixon," he asked, his voice challenging, "you say the police force will change, but will that change happen, or are these just empty promises?" His question brought a hush over the auditorium. Cynthia looked directly into his eyes, feeling the sincerity in his skepticism. She knew he represented a generation that had witnessed or heard about injustices within the system and wanted to know if they could truly trust those in uniform. Cynthia smiled and replied with genuine honesty, "I can't promise that everything will be perfect, and I can't say that every officer will change overnight, but I can assure you that I and my colleagues will work every day, step by step, to make real changes. Change isn't a quick process, and it can't happen with just words. It requires us to act, to reflect, and to commit to becoming better, more trustworthy people." Her response left the boy thoughtful and resonated with many other students. Some began nodding, realizing that she wasn't there to make flowery promises, but to convey genuine dedication to the efforts she and her department were undertaking. After the talk ended, Cynthia found herself surrounded by students eager to learn more about her work and experiences. In the crowd, she noticed Officer Williams, a young, passionate recruit, standing quietly in the back, his eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. After the students left, Williams approached her, seizing the opportunity to speak privately with someone who had inspired him throughout his training. "Captain Nixon," Williams began, his voice low but emotional, "I just wanted to say that because of you, I've realized the true meaning of this job. I used to think that being a police officer was just about enforcing the law, but you've helped me understand that our responsibility to the community goes so much deeper." Cynthia smiled, looking into Williams's bright, determined eyes, feeling the same fire she'd once had when she began her career. She understood that Williams represented the future of the police department, a new generation ready to embrace and carry out the values she was striving to instill. "Williams," she said, her voice gentle yet serious, "this job isn't always easy. There will be days when you feel like all your efforts are in vain and that nothing is changing. But remember, every small action you take, whether it's a kind word or a simple gesture, impacts the community and those around you." Williams nodded, hesitating before speaking again. "Ms. Nixon, I know the road ahead is long, and there will be tough times. But because of you, I understand that the true power of a police officer doesn't lie in authority, but in how we use it to build trust and bring safety to others." Cynthia placed a hand on Williams's shoulder, her gaze soft yet resolute. You're right, Williams. The power we hold can be a powerful tool, but it only has true meaning when used with compassion and fairness. Always remember, our job isn't to control, it's to serve. If you hold on to that, you'll become an officer who not only the community, but also you can be proud of. Williams looked at her, his eyes shining with inspiration. Cynthia's words weren't just encouragement, they were a guiding light for the path he aspired to follow. He felt a strong belief that he could be a part of the change Cynthia was pursuing. They stood together for a moment in a meaningful silence. Both Cynthia and Williams understood that the journey ahead remained full of challenges, but they knew that resilience and determination would help them overcome any obstacles. Cynthia felt a sense of peace and pride, knowing that her work had led not only to policy changes, but to inspiring the young generation of officers like Williams. As she left the high school that day, Cynthia carried with her renewed hope for the future of the police department, embodied by young, dedicated officers like Williams. She knew that her journey wasn't just about improving the police's image. It was about creating a new generation of officers grounded in compassion, fairness, and dedication to their community. With perseverance and hope, Cynthia walked away, leaving behind a powerful legacy, not just of policy changes, but of deep inspiration planted in the hearts of young officers. The seeds she had sown would continue to grow, creating a police force that was truly for the community, where people could place their trust and feel secure in the hands of committed officers like her and those she had inspired. After the inspiring talk at the high school and the commitments from young officers like Williams that gave her renewed strength, Cynthia returned to her daily work, continuing the challenging journey she had chosen. In the months that followed, she persisted in her efforts to connect with the community and uphold the reforms within the police department, believing that every step, however small, would help rebuild trust. Cynthia continued to engage in community activities, from meetings with local leaders to neighborhood visits. She was always present, listening to residents' concerns, fears, and hopes. There were difficult times when it felt as though all her efforts were being dismissed. Some people remained skeptical, viewing the reforms as superficial and the actions of Cynthia and her officers as mere attempts to appease the community. Yet Cynthia stayed steadfast, believing that only sincerity and determination could convince others. She knew it wouldn't be easy to erase the long-standing biases. Some nights, Cynthia sat alone at home, reflecting on the criticism she and her team faced. But whenever she thought about the progress they had made, no matter how modest, she felt reinvigorated. Moments like seeing a once stubborn officer change his perspective or witnessing residents warmly greeting officers with friendly smiles provided her with the motivation to keep going. One late afternoon, Cynthia received an invitation from a neighborhood to attend their annual celebration. It was a small event, but for the residents, it was significant, symbolizing unity and community spirit. Initially, she was surprised by the invitation. Not long ago, residents in this area had been some of the most vocal opponents of her reforms. The fact that they invited her now suggested that, in some way, trust was beginning to rebuild. At the celebration, Cynthia was welcomed with smiles and warm handshakes. She even received words of thanks from a few elderly residents who had once been hesitant toward the police. An elderly woman clasped her hand, tears glistening in her eyes, as she said, "Ms. Nixon, thank you for not giving up. Because of you, we feel genuinely protected and heard." These heartfelt words moved Cynthia deeply, reminding her that every effort was worthwhile. Beyond community engagement, Cynthia continued to develop training programs and reforms within the police department. She established comprehensive training courses on equity and bias, requiring all officers, from rookies to seasoned veterans, to participate. In each session, she emphasized that police officers are not just law enforcers, but must uphold the values of justice and humanity. One of the most important parts of the program involved experience sharing sessions, where officers could openly discuss the challenges and biases they faced and collaborate to find ways to overcome them. Cynthia led these discussions, listening and encouraging each officer. She saw a shift in their attitudes and a deeper understanding of their responsibilities to the community. Even officers who had initially resisted her reforms began to recognize the real value of change. During one training session, Officer Marcus, who had once been a staunch opponent of the reforms, stood up to address his colleagues. "At first, I didn't believe any of this was necessary," he admitted, his voice wavering with emotion. But looking back, I see I was wrong. What we do doesn't just affect us, but impacts the entire community. Without Captain Nixon, I wouldn't have realized this. His sincere words were met with nods and applause from everyone in the room, including Cynthia, who smiled, proud of the progress that had slowly begun to reshape even the most resistant minds. Yet, despite these initial successes, Cynthia knew her journey was just beginning. Some high-ranking officials within the local government still resisted her programs, arguing that she was going too far and unnecessarily complicating things. Some even proposed budget cuts for the police training sessions, claiming that these lessons don't produce immediate results. Cynthia understood that to implement lasting reforms, she would have to face challenges from both inside and outside the department. One evening, alone in her office, Cynthia sat by the window, looking out over the sparkling city lights of Atlanta. The city was vast, home to millions of people, each with their own stories and worries. This was the city she had dedicated her youth to, where she had fought tirelessly to protect and serve. Cynthia thought about everything she had been through, the misunderstandings, the opposition, but also the moments of success and the times she saw trust being rebuilt. She knew she had chosen a difficult path, but she never regretted it. She believed that each small change, every kind of action, and every genuine word contributed to building a brighter future. Gazing out at the city, Cynthia reminded herself that her journey was far from over, but she was willing to keep going. She was not just a police captain, but a friend, protector, and inspiration to a new generation. She knew that if she remained steadfast, the seeds she had planted would continue to grow, and one day Atlanta would be a city where everyone felt safe, respected, and trusted. Cynthia's journey would not end here. It would continue with each new generation of officers, those who dreamed of and worked toward a better future, who would carry forward the ideals she had left behind. With unwavering resolve, she looked out over the city lights, knowing she would not rest until her vision, a police force that was fair, compassionate, and sincere, became a reality. And so Cynthia's story was not just her own. It was the story of a city, of millions of people, and of a younger generation slowly redefining justice and fairness. Her footsteps would echo on, creating a lasting legacy and serving as inspiration for all who believe that even small changes can lead to extraordinary transformations. The discriminatory and abusive actions of the officer faced serious consequences when he discovered the woman he detained was a police captain. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of justice and equality in all our actions. Do you think the officer deserves forgiveness? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories. See you next time.
Marcus Henderson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his plain black t-shirt and running his hand over his shortly cropped gray hair. At 52 years old, his face showed the wisdom of his years in law enforcement, but his eyes still held the same determination they had when he first joined the police force 30 years ago. Today was different from all the other mornings in his career. He was no longer just Detective Henderson or Captain Henderson. As of yesterday, he was Police Commissioner Henderson of the Metropolitan Police Department. However, no one in the department knew about his appointment yet, except for the mayor and a few top officials. The morning news played in the background as he prepared for the day. Another story about police misconduct filled the screen, the third this month. Marcus shook his head, remembering the stack of complaint files he had reviewed during his interview process. Something needed to change, and he knew exactly where to start. Time to see how things really work on the streets, he muttered to himself, choosing to wear jeans and sneakers instead of his usual suit. His plan was simple but risky. Spend a week walking through different neighborhoods, observing his officers in action before they knew who he was. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes, not the polished version presented in meetings. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Morning, Sarah," he said to his sister. "I'm going through with it today." "Marcus, are you sure about this?" Sarah's voice carried both concern and understanding. "You're the first black police commissioner in the city's history. Why not just start with official inspections?" "Because that's not where the real problems show up, sis," he replied, checking to make sure his phone had enough storage for recording. "They need to show me who they really are, not who they pretend to be when the boss is watching." Before leaving his apartment, Marcus looked at the family photo on his wall. His father, one of the city's first black police officers in the 1960s, stood proud in his uniform. Next to it hung his father's badge, retired 20 years ago. "I'm going to finish what you started, Dad," he whispered. The morning air was crisp as Marcus walked through his neighborhood. He had chosen the park in the 4th Precinct for his first observation, an area with a history of racial profiling complaints. As he walked, he noticed how people reacted to him differently without his uniform. Some mothers pulled their children closer, and shop owners watched him more carefully through their windows. He sat on a park bench, pulling out a newspaper while keeping his eyes alert. 2 patrol cars were parked near the fountain, and he recognized Officer Thompson, a rookie, talking to an elderly woman. The interaction seemed professional, giving Marcus a small hope. Then he spotted them. 3 officers walking with the kind of swagger that made his stomach turn. He had read their files: Sergeant James Miller and Officers Brian Conway and Pete Russell. Multiple complaints filed against them, but nothing ever stuck. They were the exact reason he had chosen this undercover approach. Marcus pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages while starting the recording function. He had learned long ago that documentation was everything. As the officers got closer, their loud laughter carried across the park. They were sharing jokes that made the nearby parents cover their children's ears. A group of teenagers quickly left the basketball court as the officers approached. Marcus watched as one boy almost forgot his backpack in his hurry to leave. This wasn't how a community should react to those sworn to protect them. The weight of his new responsibility pressed down on his shoulders. These officers didn't know it yet, but change was coming. As commissioner, he would have the power to implement real reforms, to rebuild trust between the police and the community. But first, he needed evidence, undeniable proof of how some officers behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Marcus checked his watch. It was only 9:30 a.m. The day was just beginning, and he had a feeling it would be one he'd never forget. He just didn't know yet how right he was, or how this simple morning would turn into one of the most significant days in the department's history. The 3 officers continued their patrol through the park, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Marcus kept his eyes on his newspaper, but his ears focused on their approaching footsteps. Years of police work had taught him to track movement without looking obvious. Sergeant Miller stopped first, his shadow falling across Marcus's newspaper. Well, what do we have here?" His voice carried that tone Marcus had heard too many times before, false authority mixed with barely hidden contempt. Marcus looked up slowly, keeping his face neutral. Officer Conway had shifted to his left while Officer Russell moved to the right. It was a standard intimidation tactic: surround the subject, limit escape routes. Marcus had taught this very technique years ago, but only for use with confirmed suspects. "Good morning, officers," Marcus said calmly, folding his newspaper. "Is there something I can help you with?" Miller's lip curled slightly. "Yeah, we've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Marcus noticed a young mother hurrying her children away from the scene. Another man had pulled out his phone, pretending to take a selfie, but clearly aiming the camera in their direction. The public was always watching now, even if these officers hadn't learned that lesson yet. "I'm just reading the morning paper," Marcus replied, maintaining eye contact with Miller. "Last time I checked, that wasn't suspicious activity." Officer Russell snorted. "Getting a little mouthy there, aren't we?" He tapped his baton against his leg, a gesture meant to intimidate. Marcus's phone continued recording in his pocket as he remained seated, one hand visible on the newspaper, the other casually resting on his knee. He trained hundreds of officers on proper civilian interaction. These 3 were breaking every protocol in the book. "Actually," Conway chimed in, stepping closer, "we've had reports of drug dealing in this park. You match the description we received." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And what description would that be, officer?" Miller's face hardened. "You know exactly what description. Stand up, hands where we can see them." A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance. Marcus could see more phones being raised, more witnesses to what was unfolding. He stood slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. "Officers, I think we all know there haven't been any reports," Marcus said quietly. "And we all know why you really stopped to talk to me." "You calling us liars?" Miller stepped forward, his face inches from Marcus's. His breath smelled of coffee and morning cigarettes. Because that sounds like interference with police business to me. Marcus had seen this progression before: the escalation, the manufactured charges, the abuse of power. He'd spent years investigating these incidents from the other side of the blue line. Now he was experiencing it firsthand. "I'm not calling you anything, Sergeant Miller," Marcus replied, watching the officer's eyes widen slightly at the use of his name. "I'm simply stating facts." "How do you know my name?" Miller grabbed Marcus's arm roughly. "Been watching us, have you? Planning something?" Conway moved in closer. "He's probably one of those cop watchers, Sarge. Got his little phone recording and everything." He reached for Marcus's pocket. "Don't," Marcus warned, his voice carrying the natural authority of his years of command. "That would be an illegal search. Officer Conway, you have no probable cause." Russell laughed, an ugly sound. "Listen to him, talking like a lawyer. Bet you learned all that in prison, didn't you?" The crowd had grown larger. Marcus could hear murmurs of disapproval, see the anger on people's faces. This was exactly what he'd hoped to document, and exactly what he needed to change. One last time, Marcus said clearly, aware of all the recording devices around them, "I'm lawfully present in a public space. I've committed no crime. You have no reasonable suspicion for this stop." Miller's face turned red. "On your knees," he barked, shoving Marcus's shoulder. "Now." As Marcus felt the first push, he stayed perfectly still, his mind already calculating how this encounter would transform his department. He just hadn't expected it to provide such clear evidence so quickly. The morning sun cast 3 long shadows across the park grass, 3 shadows that would soon learn the true meaning of accountability. Marcus's knees hit the hard ground as Officer Conway pushed him down from behind. The gravel of the park path dug into his skin through his jeans. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, their phones recording every moment of the unfolding scene. "See how quickly they learned to kneel." Sergeant Miller sneered, pacing in front of Marcus like a playground bully. His polished boots stopped right in front of Marcus's face. "Not so full of clever words now, are you?" Officer Russell had disappeared briefly to their patrol car, and now he came jogging back with something that made Marcus's blood run cold. In his hands was an old, rusty ball and chain, a relic from the department's historical display case that was supposed to be locked away. "Look what I found in the trunk, Sarge," Russell said with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Thought we could give our friend here a history lesson." Marcus kept his face calm, but his mind raced. This was beyond simple harassment or profiling. This was a deliberate act of humiliation with clear racial intent. His phone was still recording in his pocket, capturing every word. "You officers need to think very carefully about what you're doing," Marcus said evenly, his eyes meeting Miller's. "This isn't something you can take back." Conway laughed, twisting Marcus's arm harder behind his back. "Listen to him, still trying to tell us what to do. Maybe we should show him how we handled attitude back in the old days." The ball and chain made a heavy sound as Russell dropped it next to Marcus. It wasn't the massive kind from ancient times, but a smaller version used for display purposes. Still, it was real metal, real chains, and carried real weight, both physical and symbolic. "Hold him steady," Miller commanded, reaching for the shackle. "Let's see how fast he can run with this little accessory." More people had gathered, their faces showing mixture of horror and anger. Marcus could hear someone in the crowd saying they were calling 911. The irony wasn't lost on him, calling the police on the police. "Remember when they had these on all the mile markers?" Russell joked as Miller fastened the shackle around Marcus's ankle. "Maybe we should bring that tradition back." The metal was cold against Marcus's skin. He felt the weight of it, not just physically but historically, all the pain and suffering it represented. These officers were turning a dark piece of history into their sick idea of entertainment. "You know what's really going to be funny?" Conway said, still holding Marcus down. "When we make him walk through the park like this. Give the kids a real education about history." Marcus stayed silent now, letting them dig their graves deeper. Each word they spoke, each action they took, was another nail in the coffin of their careers. They were so drunk on their power that they didn't notice the growing number of witnesses, or the fury building in the watching crowd. The chain rattled against the ground as Miller yanked it, making Marcus shift his position. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Where's all that legal talk gone? A young boy in the crowd started crying, and his mother hurriedly tried to shield his eyes from the scene. This made Marcus's jaw tighten. These officers weren't just humiliating him, they were traumatizing a whole community. "Stand up," Miller ordered, pulling on the chain again. "Let's go for a little walk." Marcus rose slowly, the ball weighing heavy against his leg. He could have revealed his identity at any moment, could have stopped this degradation, but he knew that would defeat the purpose. This had to play out. The department needed to see how far these officers would go when they thought nobody with power was watching. "Start walking," Russell commanded, poking Marcus's back with his baton. "And make it slow. We want everyone to get a good look." The chain dragged across the ground, its rattling sound echoing through the suddenly quiet park. Children had stopped playing. Parents stood frozen. Joggers halted mid-stride. Everyone watched as 3 officers of the law forced their new commissioner, though they didn't know it yet, to walk with a ball and chain through a public park on a sunny morning in 2024. Marcus took each step deliberately, knowing that every clank of the chain was another piece of evidence. Soon, very soon, these officers would learn the true weight of their actions. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the park as Marcus took another forced step, the ball and chain scraping against the concrete path. His phone continued recording in his pocket, capturing every sound, every word, every rattle of the chain. Sarah Chen, a local high school teacher, had been grading papers on a nearby bench when the incident began. Now she stood with her phone steady, filming everything. Her hands shook with anger, but her camera remained focused on the 3 officers and their victim. "This is going straight to the news," she said loudly enough for the officers to hear. "And to every social media platform I know." Sergeant Miller turned toward her, his face twisted with anger. "Back off, lady, or you'll be next. This is police business." Marcus noticed how Miller's threat only made more phones appear. People who had been hesitant to film now pulled out their devices. The park had become a circle of witnesses, all documenting what would soon become the biggest scandal in the department's history. "Hey, YouTube," Officer Conway called out mockingly, waving at the cameras. "Make sure you get my good side." He seemed to think this was all some kind of joke, completely blind to how his actions would look to the world. A teenage boy with a professional-looking camera pushed his way to the front of the crowd. Marcus recognized him as Joey Williams, editor of the local high school newspaper. The boy had won awards for his coverage of social justice issues. "I'm streaming this live on Instagram," Joey announced, his young voice carrying across the park. "There are already thousands of viewers." Officer Russell stepped toward Joey, but several adults moved to stand between them. The crowd was growing braver, forming a circle around the scene, but keeping their distance. Close enough to document everything, far enough to stay safe. Marcus could feel the chain rubbing against his ankle as he was forced to keep walking. Each step was captured by dozens of cameras, each rattle of the chain recorded in high definition. The morning sun made everything crystal clear. There would be no blurry footage, no room for doubt about what was happening. An older man in a business suit had his tablet out, speaking clearly into it. "I'm on a video call with Channel 5 News right now. They're recording everything and sending a crew." He stared directly at Miller, his voice steady. "This is going on the evening news." The 3 officers exchanged glances, but they were too far committed to stop now. Pride and power had blinded them to the consequences that were rushing toward them like an oncoming train. "Let them record," Miller declared, pulling harder on the chain. "Maybe people need to see how we handle troublemakers in this neighborhood." A woman in scrubs, probably heading home from a night shift at the nearby hospital, was typing furiously on her phone. "I'm sending this directly to the police commissioner's office," she announced. "My sister works there as a secretary." Marcus almost smiled at that, but kept his face neutral. The woman had no way of knowing she was looking right at the commissioner himself. Her heart was in the right place, though, and soon enough she'd learn the truth. Through it all, Marcus remained silent, letting the documentation build. His trained eye noticed details the officers had missed. The traffic camera at the park entrance that had probably caught the beginning of the incident, the surveillance cameras on the coffee shop across the street, and even a Google Street View car that had slowly passed by during the confrontation. In the age of technology, there was no such thing as a hidden incident anymore. These officers were about to learn that lesson the hard way. "Walk faster," Conway ordered, jabbing Marcus's back again with his baton. But Marcus maintained his slow, deliberate pace. Each step was being preserved forever, each moment captured from multiple angles. The morning light caught the chain's metal links, making them shine in all the videos, a perfect symbol of the officer's racism and abuse of power. The crowd had swelled to over 50 people now, all with their phones out, all documenting. The park had become an amphitheater, and these three officers were performing their last act as police. They just didn't know it yet. The weight of the ball and chain was heavy, but Marcus knew the evidence being gathered was far heavier. Soon, very soon, that weight would come crashing down on the heads of these three officers who thought they were above the law. The sound of approaching police sirens cut through the morning air. Sergeant Miller smiled, clearly expecting backup to support his actions. The crowd parted as two police vehicles pulled up to the park entrance, their lights flashing. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez stepped out of the first car, responding to multiple 911 calls about officers harassing a civilian. She was a 20-year veteran of the force, known for her strict adherence to protocol. As she walked toward the scene, her eyes widened at the sight of the ball and chain. "What in God's name is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp with authority. Miller straightened up, grinning. "Just teaching this troublemaker a lesson, Lieutenant. Nothing to worry about." Lieutenant Rodriguez moved closer, her eyes scanning the scene professionally. Then she saw Marcus's face. The color drained from her cheeks as recognition hit her like a physical blow. "Dear Lord," she whispered, then quickly recovered her composure. "Officers, remove that chain immediately." "But Lieutenant," Conway protested, "this guy was—" "Remove that chain right now," Rodriguez ordered, her voice like steel. "That's an order, Officer Conway." Miller stepped forward, confused by the lieutenant's reaction. "Ma'am, we have everything under control here. This subject was—" "Sergeant Miller," Rodriguez cut him off, her voice carrying across the park. "Do you know who this man is?" "Just some troublemaker trying to—" "This is Police Commissioner Marcus Henderson." The words fell like bombs in the morning air. The crowd gasped. Phones that had been recording suddenly lowered as people turned to look at each other in shock. The only sound was the quiet whir of the chain as it slipped from Miller's suddenly lifeless fingers. Conway's face turned the color of sour milk. Russell took 3 steps backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Miller stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Commissioner," Miller finally managed to squeak out. But we weren't informed." "Remove the chain." Rodriguez enunciated each word carefully, her hand resting meaningfully on her weapon. Russell fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the key. The chain finally fell away, leaving an angry red mark around Marcus's ankle. Marcus stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked at each officer in turn, his face calm but his eyes blazing with controlled anger. "Officers Miller, Conway, and Russell," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "I believe you've just provided an excellent demonstration of why I chose to conduct an undercover assessment of our department." The 3 officers stood rigid, terror evident on their faces as the full impact of their actions began to sink in. "Your badges and weapons," Rodriguez commanded. "Hand them over. Now." As the officers slowly removed their badges and guns, Marcus turned to address the crowd, which had grown even larger. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for documenting this incident. I'm Police Commissioner Marcus Henderson, and what you've witnessed today is exactly why we need major reforms in our department." Someone in the crowd started clapping, and soon the whole park erupted in applause. Joey, a high school journalist, pushed forward. "Commissioner, your appointment wasn't even announced yet. Was this a planned sting operation?" Marcus shook his head. "No, young man, I simply wanted to see how our officers behave when they think nobody's watching. Unfortunately, these 3 officers showed me exactly what I needed to see." Miller suddenly found his voice. "Sir, please, we didn't know. We were just—" "Just what, Sergeant Miller?" Marcus turned to face him. "Just racially profiling a citizen. Just abusing your authority. Just using department property to recreate one of the darkest chapters of our history." The 3 officers seemed to shrink under his gaze. Conway looked like he might throw up. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward. "Sir, Would you like me to call internal affairs? No need, Lieutenant. Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. I believe we have all the evidence we need right here. Plus, he gestured to the crowd with their phones. I think we have plenty of backup copies. The morning sun now felt impossibly hot on the three officers' backs as they realized their careers, and possibly their freedom, had just gone up in flames, all because they chose the wrong random civilian to harass. 3 hours after the park incident, the police headquarters buzzed with nervous energy. Word had spread fast, and every officer in the building knew that something big was about to happen. The emergency meeting called by Commissioner Henderson was scheduled for 2 p.m. sharp. Marcus sat in his new office, reviewing the videos from the park. His own phone recording played on his laptop while dozens of civilian videos flooded social media. The local news had already picked up the story, running it as their breaking news headline. New police commissioner experiences racism from his own officers. A knock on his door made him look up. Lieutenant Rodriguez entered, carrying a thick folder. Sir, I have the complete files on Miller, Conway, and Russell, she said, placing the folder on his desk. It's worse than we thought. There are 15 previous complaints against them that were mysteriously dismissed. Marcus nodded, not surprised. And the ball and chain. Stolen from the department's historical display 3 months ago, Rodriguez replied. They thought it was funny to keep it in their patrol car. We found text messages joking about using it to teach lessons. The 3 officers sat in separate holding cells downstairs. Their union representative had already called 4 times, but Marcus wasn't ready to deal with that yet. He had bigger plans for the afternoon. At exactly 2 p.m., Marcus walked into the main conference room. Every captain, lieutenant, and sergeant in the department sat there, along with representatives from each precinct. The room fell silent as he entered. He didn't sit down. Instead, he connected his phone to the projector and played the morning's video. For 12 painful minutes, the room watched as 3 of their own officers racially profiled, harassed, and humiliated their new commissioner. When the video ended, Marcus finally spoke. This morning, I experienced what countless citizens in our city face every day. His voice was calm, but carried throughout the room. The only difference is, I had the power to do something about it. He clicked to the next slide, showing social media reactions. The story had gone viral, with millions of views and shares. National news networks were already picking it up. Our department is now the face of everything wrong with modern policing, Marcus continued. But we're also going to become the face of real change. He pulled out a thick document from his briefcase. This is the Reform Action Plan I've spent 6 months developing. I had planned to implement it gradually. But after this morning's events, we're going to start right now. The room stirred uncomfortably as he began listing the changes. Mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off during shifts. Civilian Oversight Committee with real power. Complete retraining for every officer. Zero tolerance for racial profiling. New community engagement programs. Independent investigation unit for all complaints. Sir, one captain spoke up. These changes, they're pretty dramatic. So was watching 3 of our officers chain me up like a slave for their amusement. Marcus replied sharply. Would you like to see the video again? The captain sank back in his chair. Marcus walked around the room slowly. Every person in this room has a choice to make right now. You can be part of the solution, or you can hand in your badge. There will be no middle ground anymore. He stopped at the front again. Miller, Conway, and Russell will face criminal charges, but they're not the only problem. Everyone who knew about their behavior and did nothing is also part of the problem. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. By the end of today, I want every complaint file from the past 5 years on my desk, every hidden report, every dismissed case, every covered-up incident. If I have to find them myself, the consequences will be severe. Marcus clicked to his final slide, showing the photo of him with the ball and chain. This image will either be remembered as the day our department hit rock bottom, or the day we finally started climbing toward real change. The choice is yours. He looked at each person in the room. Meeting dismissed. The real work starts now. As the officers filed out, Marcus knew the hardest part was still ahead. Changing a culture of racism and abuse wouldn't happen overnight. But as he watched the news coverage continue to spread, He realized that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the most painful moments. The ball and chain now sat on his desk, a reminder of why he took this job in the first place. 1 month after the park incident, Marcus stood in front of the police academy's newest class of recruits. The ball and chain sat on a pedestal beside him, no longer a tool of mockery, but a powerful teaching tool. Your training will be different from any class before you, he told the diverse group of faces looking up at him, because you're going to learn from our department's biggest mistake. The video from the park played on the screen behind him. The room was silent except for a few gasps as they watched the commissioner being chained and humiliated by former officers. Marcus had shown this video 20 times in the past month, and it never got easier to watch. Those officers thought they were untouchable, he continued after the video ended. Today, they're facing federal civil rights charges. But this isn't just about punishing bad officers. It's about creating better ones. In the back of the room, Sarah Chen, the teacher who had filmed the incident, sat taking notes. Marcus had hired her to lead the new community relations training program. Who better to teach officers about civilian perspective than someone who had documented police misconduct firsthand? Your new training includes something we've never had before, Marcus explained. Every recruit will spend 2 weeks living in different neighborhoods throughout the city. No uniforms, no badges, no special treatment. You'll experience what it feels like to be viewed with suspicion just because of how you look. The recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the traditional police training they had expected. Joey Williams, a high school journalist who had live-streamed the park incident, now had an official position too. Despite being only 17, he ran the department's new social media accountability program. His live feeds of community meetings and police training sessions were helping rebuild public trust. Transparency isn't optional anymore, Marcus told the recruits. Every interaction you have with the public will be recorded, not just by your body cameras, but by civilians. Accept it. Welcome it. If you're doing your job right, you have nothing to fear from being recorded. Lieutenant Rodriguez, recently promoted to captain, entered the room with a stack of new training manuals. These weren't the old, dusty rulebooks. These were filled with real cases, including the park incident, teaching officers what not to do. Your training will include extensive work with the communities you'll serve, Marcus continued. You'll attend neighborhood meetings, not as officers but as listeners. You'll learn the names of the kids playing in the parks, the elderly folks who need help with groceries, the shop owners who stay open late. He picked up the chain from its pedestal. This chain represents our department's darkest moment, but it also represents our turning point. He placed it back down carefully. Every officer who graduates from this academy will spend their first day on the job carrying this chain for 1 hour. Not as a joke, not as punishment, but as a reminder of the weight of responsibility you carry. The reforms weren't just happening in the academy. Across the city, changes were visible. Police stations now had community review boards with real power. Civilian complaints were investigated by an independent unit. Officers were required to live in the neighborhoods they patrolled. The old way of policing is dead, Marcus declared. You're not here to be warriors. You're here to be guardians. The people you serve aren't your enemies. They're your neighbors. He walked among the recruits, making eye contact with each one. Some of your fellow officers aren't happy with these changes. They say we're soft. They say we're giving up power. But true power doesn't come from fear or force. It comes from trust and respect. A young recruit raised her hand. Sir, what happened to the officers who did that to you? They're scheduled for trial next month, Marcus replied, but their biggest punishment isn't jail time. It's knowing that their actions led to real change. Their names will be remembered not for what they did to me, but for what they taught our department about the need for reform. As the session ended, Marcus watched the recruits file out, talking quietly among themselves. They were the future of the department, a future that looked very different from its past. The ball and chain caught the afternoon light, its shadow stretching across the floor. But now it cast a different kind of shadow, not one of shame, but one of transformation. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning in the park. Marcus Henderson sat in his office, reviewing the department's progress report. The changes were more successful than anyone had expected. On his wall hung 3 items: the front page of the newspaper from the day after the incident, his father's old police badge, and a photograph of the graduating class of new officers. the first batch trained under the new system. Below these hung the ball and chain, now enclosed in a clear case with a simple plaque that read, "Never again." A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, recently promoted from her teaching position, entered with the latest community feedback reports. "The numbers are impressive, Commissioner," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "Civilian complaints are down 70%. Community trust ratings are up 85%. And our department's story is being used as a model for police reform across the country." Marcus nodded, thinking about how much had changed. The 3 officers who had humiliated him were now serving their sentences. Miller got 5 years, Conway and Russell each received 3. Their trial had made national headlines, but more importantly, it had sent a clear message. No one was above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. Joey Williams, now a freshman in journalism school, had written a powerful series about the department's transformation. His articles showed before and after pictures of police-community relations. Where there had once been tension and fear, there were now community barbecues and youth programs. "We have visitors in the lobby," Chen mentioned with a smile. "Remember that little boy who was crying in the park that day? He and his mother are here. He just won first place in his school's essay contest. The topic was how I want to change the world." Marcus stood up, straightening his uniform. "What did he write about?" "He wrote about wanting to become a police officer," Chen replied. "He said he wants to be like the new kind of officers he sees in his neighborhood, the ones who help old ladies cross the street and play basketball with kids after school." Walking through the department hallways, Marcus saw the physical changes everywhere. The walls displayed community artwork. The old Wall of Honor now included civilian heroes alongside police officers. Every desk had a small sign reading "Protect and Serve, not Control and Dominate." In the lobby, 8-year-old Tommy Martinez sat with his mother. When he saw Marcus, his eyes lit up. "Commissioner Henderson, I wrote about you in my essay." Marcus knelt down to the boy's level. "Did you? I'd love to hear it." Tommy pulled out his wrinkled paper and began reading. "6 months ago, I saw something scary in the park. Bad police officers were being mean to a man. I was crying, but then something magical happened. The man turned out to be in charge of all the police, and he changed everything. Now the police in my neighborhood are my friends. They help people instead of scaring them. When I grow up, I want to be a police officer too, because now I know police can be heroes in the right way." Marcus felt his eyes getting wet. This was why he had endured that humiliation in the park. This was why all the hard work of reform mattered. Later that afternoon, Marcus visited the park where it all happened. The place looked different now. New playground equipment had been installed. Community bulletin boards displayed police and neighborhood news. Officers patrolled in pairs, stopping to chat with residents and play with children. His phone buzzed with a message. The governor wanted to implement his reform program statewide. Other cities were requesting his guidance on their own police transformation projects. What had started with a moment of shame had grown into a movement of change. As the sun set over the park, Marcus watched a young officer push a little girl on the swings while her grateful mother looked on. Another officer was teaching teenagers proper basketball techniques. This was what policing should be, part of the community, not apart from it. The weight of that ball and chain had been heavy, but it had forced the entire department to confront its darkest problems. Now that weight had been transformed into something else. The weight of responsibility, of trust, of duty to serve and protect all people equally. Marcus touched his father's badge, which he now wore every day. "We did it, Dad," he whispered. "We finally did it." The park was peaceful as darkness fell, filled with the sounds of children laughing and neighbors chatting. And if you listened carefully, you could hear the sound of real change, not in the clank of chains, but in the simple trust between a community and those sworn to protect it. The clock on Maya Thompson's dashboard showed 11:43 p.m. as she drove her black Honda Civic through the quiet streets of downtown Harrison City. The night shift at Memorial Hospital had been long, filled with the usual mix of emergencies and routine care that kept her cover as a registered nurse believable. What none of her coworkers knew was that behind her gentle smile and caring demeanor lay the sharp mind of a federal investigator with 15 years of experience bringing down corruption rings. Maya adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her tired face. At 42, She had mastered the art of blending in, wearing simple scrubs and minimal makeup that made her look like any other hardworking healthcare worker. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her only jewelry was a simple silver necklace, though few would guess it contained a tiny recording device. The streets were almost empty at this hour. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the occasional late-night worker hurried past closed storefronts. Maya's mind wandered to the evidence she'd gathered over the past 6 months. The pattern was becoming clear. A troubling number of successful black professionals in Harrison City had been arrested on suspicious drug charges, their careers and lives destroyed by convictions that seemed to follow the same script every time. Lost in thought, she'd almost missed the police cruiser that pulled out behind her. Maya's trained eye noticed it immediately in her mirror, Unit 437, one of the vehicles she'd been watching. Her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but her face remained calm. She'd been a federal agent too long to show any reaction. At the next red light, Maya came to a complete stop. She watched as a second police cruiser suddenly appeared, pulling up alongside her. Her heart rate remained steady. This was exactly the kind of scenario she'd been waiting for. She knew Officers Plant and Reynolds were working tonight. Their patterns had become predictable to her after months of surveillance. The light turned green, but before Maya could move, flashing blue and red lights filled her mirrors. The police radio crackled loudly enough for her to hear. "Dispatch, we've got a possible match on that drug trafficking suspect. Black female, black Honda Civic." Maya took a slow, deep breath. This was the moment her team had been preparing for. She carefully moved her hand to her hospital ID badge, making sure its hidden camera had a clear view. The bodycam footage from these officers had a suspicious habit of going missing during controversial arrests. The first officer approached her window, flashlight beam intentionally hitting her eyes. Maya recognized Officer Plant's voice, dripping with fake authority. "Ma'am, turn off your vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." Maya complied perfectly, her movements slow and deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. "We've had reports of drug trafficking in the area," Officer Reynolds said, appearing on the passenger side. His hand rested too eagerly on his weapon. "Your vehicle matches the description of a suspect's car." Maya noticed how Reynolds kept glancing at her hospital ID badge with barely hidden disdain. She knew what they saw: another successful black woman they could tear down, another career they could destroy. They had no idea they were walking right into a federal investigation. "I'm just heading home from my shift at Memorial," Maya said, using the tired voice of someone who'd spent 12 hours on their feet. "I'm a registered nurse there." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Plant ordered, his tone making the respectful words sound like an insult. "We're going to need to search your car." Maya's mind raced through the proper procedures they were already violating. No probable cause, no warrant, no real reason for the stop. As she carefully opened her door, she caught a glimpse of Officer Reynolds moving toward her trunk, his partner deliberately positioning himself to block her view. She stood calmly on the sidewalk, fighting back a small smile as she heard the faint click of her hidden camera recording everything. These officers had done this so many times before, destroying lives with their planted evidence and falsified reports. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were finally providing the evidence that would expose their entire corrupt operation. What Officers Plant and Reynolds didn't know as they began their search was that every move they made was being documented. They had no idea that the quiet nurse they targeted was about to become their worst nightmare. Maya Thompson stood silently in the cool night air, playing the role of a worried victim perfectly, while inside she was already composing the first paragraphs of what would become a devastating federal indictment. Officer Plant circled Maya's Honda Civic like a hungry wolf, his flashlight beam dancing across the clean exterior. The midnight air had grown colder, but Maya didn't shiver. She stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, watching as Officer Reynolds made a show of calling in their stop to dispatch. Neither officer wore their body cameras, exactly as she'd expected. "Pop the trunk," Plant ordered, not bothering to hide his smirk. When Maya pressed the button on her key fob, the trunk opened with a soft click. She noticed how Reynolds quickly moved to block her view, his broad shoulders creating a convenient screen for whatever Plant was doing back there. Maya heard the familiar sounds of her trunk being searched: shuffling, movement, the thud of her emergency medical kit being pushed aside. Then came the sound she'd been waiting for, the slight rustle of a plastic bag being removed from a pocket. Her hidden camera caught everything as Plant made a dramatic show of discovering a package wrapped in black plastic. Well, what do we have here? Plant's voice carried false surprise as he held up the package. Looks like we got ourselves a nurse who's delivering more than just medical care. Reynolds grabbed Maya's arm, his fingers digging in harder than necessary. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Maya complied, maintaining her role as a scared nurse perfectly. That's not mine, she protested, letting her voice shake just enough. I don't know where that came from. They'd all say that, Reynolds laughed, roughly snapping handcuffs around her wrists. The metal bit into her skin, but Maya knew every bruise would be more evidence. As Reynolds patted her down with inappropriate thoroughness, Plant was already calling in their discovery to dispatch. Suspect found in possession of approximately 500 grams of what appears to be cocaine, Plant reported, making sure his voice carried to where Maya stood. High-grade stuff too. Looks like someone's been using their hospital access to move product. Maya let tears fill her eyes, real ones, though not for the reasons the officers assumed. She thought about all the other innocent people these corrupt cops had destroyed, all the lives they'd ruined with their planted evidence and false arrests. Her own discomfort was worth it to finally bring them to justice. At the police station, the humiliation tactics began. They left Maya sitting in the interview room for hours, her requests for water ignored. Through the two-way mirror, she could hear them laughing, proudly congratulating themselves on another successful frame-up. When they finally entered to interview her, Plant carried a thick file folder. Maya Thompson, he read, his tone mocking. Registered nurse at Memorial Hospital. No prior arrests. Guess there's a first time for everything, right? I want a lawyer, Maya said firmly, just as any innocent person would. Oh, you'll need one, Reynolds sneered, dropping a stack of forms on the table. Sign here to acknowledge the drugs we found in your possession. Maya looked at the forms, noting how they'd already filled in most details, weight, purity, estimated street value, all perfectly matching the pattern she'd documented in dozens of other false arrests. I'm not signing anything without a lawyer present. Plant leaned forward, his breath smelling of coffee and satisfaction. Listen here, nurse. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Right now, you're looking at possession with intent to distribute. That's 15 years minimum. Sign the forms, cooperate. Maybe the DA cuts you a deal. Maya let more tears fall, playing her part. Please, she whispered. I have a career, a life. I help people. Should've thought about that before you started pushing drugs, Reynolds said. He turned to Plant. Call Judge Harrison. They'll know how to handle this one. The officers left her alone again, confident in their power. Through the thin walls, Maya could hear them making calls, setting their corrupt machine in motion. What they didn't know was that every word, every action, every abuse of power was being recorded. Her hidden camera had captured the planted evidence, and the recording device in her necklace was catching every conversation. Sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of the interview room, Maya Thompson allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Officers Plant and Reynolds thought they were destroying another innocent life. Instead, they were finally providing the evidence that would destroy their entire corrupt operation. All she had to do now was wait. 3 days after her arrest, Maya Thompson sat in courtroom 4B of the Harrison City Courthouse. The hard wooden bench pressed uncomfortably against her back as she watched Judge Richard Harrison enter the room. At 65, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes, Harrison had a reputation for being merciless, especially with defendants of color. Maya knew his track record well. It was one of the reasons she'd chosen this jurisdiction for her investigation. Her court-appointed lawyer, Dennis Weber, shuffled papers beside her. Weber was exactly what officers Plant and Reynolds had hoped for: overworked, underprepared, and more interested in plea deals than justice. What they didn't know was that Maya had specifically requested him, knowing his reputation for missing obvious defense strategies would make her look more vulnerable. All rise, the bailiff called out. Judge Harrison took his seat, his black robe settling around him like dark wings. His eyes swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on Maya. She saw the slight curl of his lip, the quick glance he shared with Officer Plant, who stood at the back of the courtroom. Case number 2025 CR 1443, State versus Maya Thompson, the clerk announced. Charges are possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, a class of felony. Judge Harrison peered at Maya over his reading glasses. How does the defendant plead? Weber stood up, his tie slightly crooked. Not guilty, Your Honor. Bail hearing will commence, Harrison declared, though Maya could tell from his tone that his mind was already made up. The hidden recording device in her necklace picked up every word as the prosecutor, Sarah Martinez, stepped forward. Your Honor, the state requests bail be set at $2 million, Martinez announced. The defendant was found in possession of a significant amount of high-grade cocaine. Her position as a nurse gives her access to medical facilities, making her a flight risk. Weber's defense was predictably weak. Your Honor, my client has no prior record. She's a respected nurse with deep ties to the community. We request release on her own recognizance. Maya watched the performance unfold, noting how Judge Harrison pretended to consider both sides. Through her hidden camera, she captured the subtle signals between Harrison and Officer Plant. A slight nod, a quick hand gesture. These were the small details that would later help prove their coordination. Bail is set at $1 million, Harrison announced, bringing down his gavel with unnecessary force. Next hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. As the bailiff led Maya away, she caught snippets of a whispered conversation between Officer Plant and Judge Harrison's clerk. Money would change hands later that day. She knew her team was already tracking the offshore accounts where Harrison hid his bribes. Back in her holding cell, Maya sat quietly while Weber explained her options. Listen, Miss Thompson, he said, not meeting her eyes. The evidence against you is strong. Judge Harrison has a 98% conviction rate on drug cases. If you plead guilty now, we might get 10 years instead of 15. Maya let her voice tremble. But I'm innocent. Those drugs weren't mine. Weber sighed, exactly as she'd expected. They were found in your car. Your fingerprints were on the package. Of course they were. Plant had made sure of that while she was handcuffed, pressing her fingers against the plastic bag when he thought no one was watching. Her hidden camera had caught that too. What about security cameras? Maya asked. There must have been some at that intersection. All malfunctioning that night, Weber replied, shuffling his papers again. Look, I've seen this before. Judge Harrison doesn't look kindly on defendants who waste the court's time. Maya buried her face in her hands, appearing to cry while hiding her small smile. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. That evening, as she was returned to her cell, she heard Officer Reynolds talking to another cop. Judge Harrison's gonna make an example of this one, Reynolds laughed. Says he's tired of these uppity professionals thinking they can get away with anything. Called in a favor with the DA too. No deals offered. Maya lay on her thin prison mattress, mentally recording every detail. In her years as a federal investigator, she brought down drug cartels and exposed corporate fraud. But this case was different. This wasn't just about crime. It was about systematic corruption that destroyed innocent lives through the very system meant to protect them. Tomorrow, her real legal team would begin the next phase of the operation. But for tonight, Maya Thompson played her role perfectly. Just another victim of a corrupt system that was about to learn it had finally targeted the wrong person. A week after her bail hearing, Maya Thompson walked through the quiet halls of Memorial Hospital's night shift, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floor. Her mother had borrowed against her house to post bail, playing perfectly into Maya's cover story. What Officers Plant and Reynolds didn't know was that the bail money had actually come from the FBI's operation budget. Maya stopped at the nurse's station, pretending to check patient charts while actually reviewing a hidden file on her tablet. Her colleague, Sarah Chen, approached with concern in her eyes. I still can't believe they arrested you, Sarah whispered, setting down her coffee. You're like the most honest person I know. Maya gave a sad smile, using the conversation to scan the hallway. The worst part is, I'm not the only one. Remember Dr. Jackson from cardiology? Sarah's eyes widened. Lisa Jackson? The one who lost her medical license last year. Same officers, same judge, Maya said quietly, noting how another nurse, Keisha Williams, had moved closer to listen. I've been doing some research since I got out on bail. There's a pattern. Keisha glanced around before speaking. My sister's friend, Angela. She was a bank manager. Same thing happened to her 6 months ago. Officers found drugs in her car during a random stop. Judge Harrison gave her 12 years. This was exactly what Maya had been waiting for. She let her voice shake slightly. How many others are there? Throughout her shift, Maya collected stories. A real estate agent, a corporate lawyer, a high school principal, all successful black women, all arrested by officers Plant and Reynolds, all sentenced by Judge Harrison. Her hidden camera captured every conversation, building a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. During her lunch break, Maya sat in her car, pretending to eat while actually transmitting data to her FBI team. Her tablet showed the financial trails they'd uncovered. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfers disguised as business investments, property bought through shell companies. Judge Harrison's corruption went deeper than anyone had suspected. A police cruiser rolled slowly through the hospital parking lot. Officer Reynolds doing his nightly intimidation drive-by. Maya appeared to shrink in her seat, but her hidden camera captured everything, including the way Reynolds spoke into his radio with a smirk. Back inside, Maya visited the hospital's records department. Under the guise of checking old patient files, she accessed employment records of former staff members who'd been arrested. The pattern was clear. Each victim had been at the height of their career. Each arrest had seemed perfectly timed to destroy not just their freedom, but their professional reputation. Ms. Thompson? A voice made her jump. It was Dr. Martinez, the chief of surgery. I heard about your situation. The hospital board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your employment. Maya let tears fill her eyes. Please, I need this job. I'm innocent. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable. Judge Harrison called personally. He said keeping you employed would look bad for the hospital. Perfect. Another piece of evidence showing Harrison's reach beyond the courtroom. Maya's recording devices captured everything as Dr. Martinez explained how the judge had suggested that employing someone awaiting trial would jeopardize their upcoming license review. That evening, as her shift ended, Maya received a text from a burner phone. Her real legal team had found 3 more victims in nearby counties. Same officers, same judge, same pattern of destroyed careers and suspicious financial transactions. In the parking lot, Maya spotted Officer Plant talking to a security guard, pointing at her car. She pretended not to notice, but her camera caught their entire conversation about setting up extra surveillance on her suspicious activities. Driving home, Maya took a different route than usual, making sure she wasn't followed. Her mind processed everything she'd learned. The corruption wasn't just about drugs and bribes. It was about power and systematic destruction. Plant, Reynolds, and Harrison weren't just dirty cops and a corrupt judge. They were part of a larger machine that targeted successful black women, using the legal system itself as a weapon. As she parked in her driveway, Maya noticed a new car across the street. Through her rearview mirror, she saw the driver watching her house, another of Harrison's intimidation tactics. But what they saw as fear in her cautious movements was actually careful documentation. Every photo they took of her, every attempt to frighten her, only added to the mountain of evidence she was building. Tomorrow, she would meet secretly with her FBI team to plan the next phase. But tonight, Maya Thompson, the nurse under investigation, the preliminary hearing room was packed as Maya Thompson sat beside her court-appointed lawyer, Dennis Weber. 2 weeks had passed since her arrest, and everything was about to change. Weber shuffled through his messy papers, unaware that his apparent incompetence was about to serve a greater purpose. Officer Plant sat at the prosecution's table, looking smug in his pressed uniform. Officer Reynolds stood at the back of the room, as always. Judge Harrison peered down from his bench, his face showing the same cold confidence he'd shown to countless other innocent women before Maya. Your Honor, Weber began, his tie crooked as usual. The defense would like to present evidence regarding the night of Ms. Thompson's arrest. Judge Harrison sighed with obvious annoyance. Proceed, Mr. Weber. Weber fumbled with his briefcase, dropping several papers on the floor. As he bent to pick them up, Maya noticed Officer Plant's slight smirk, but the smirk faded when Weber pulled out a thick folder labeled traffic camera records. Your Honor, Weber said, his voice surprisingly steady, we've obtained footage from the traffic cameras at the intersection where my client was arrested. Officer Plant's face tightened. Reynolds straightened up at the back of the room. Judge Harrison's hand gripped his gavel a little tighter. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecutor jumped in. We were informed all cameras in that area were malfunctioning that night. Weber blinked innocently. Oh, not the city cameras, Your Honor. I'm referring to the private security cameras from the new bank building on that corner. They were installed last month. Their footage shows everything that happened during Miss Thompson's arrest. Maya kept her eyes down, hiding her satisfaction as she watched Officer Plant's leg begin to bounce nervously under the table. Through her hidden camera, she captured his quick glance at Reynolds, who had pulled out his phone and was typing frantically. Furthermore, Weber continued, these records show Officer Plant approaching my client's trunk exactly 17 seconds before calling in the discovery of drugs. Barely enough time to open the trunk, let alone conduct a thorough search. Judge Harrison's face had turned slightly red. Mr. Weber, this evidence wasn't properly submitted during discovery. My apologies, Your Honor, Weber said, dropping more papers. I only received these files this morning. I also have some interesting bank records that came with them. The word bank made Judge Harrison's hand freeze on his gavel. Officer Plant was now openly staring at Reynolds, who had slipped out of the courtroom door. This is highly irregular, the prosecutor protested. We need time to review this new evidence. Of course, Weber agreed, somehow managing to knock over his water glass while spreading out more papers. While we're reviewing things, I also found some interesting connections between offshore accounts and recent property purchases in the Caribbean. Maya watched as Judge Harrison's face went from red to pale. She could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to figure out how this bumbling defense lawyer had stumbled onto his secret accounts. This hearing is adjourned until tomorrow, Harrison announced abruptly, standing up. All parties need time to properly review this new evidence. As people began filing out, Maya observed Officer Plant cornering Weber in the hallway. Where did you get those bank records? Plant demanded, his voice low and threatening. Weber dropped his briefcase again, papers scattering everywhere. Oh, they just came in the mail. Anonymous source. Very interesting reading, especially the parts about regular deposits matching dates of certain arrests. Plant grabbed his radio, barking orders to find Reynolds. Through the courthouse windows, Maya could see Reynolds in the parking lot, making frantic phone calls. In the bathroom, Maya heard two clerks whispering. Judge Harrison just canceled all his afternoon appointments. He's on the phone with his lawyer. Everything was falling apart for them, exactly as planned. Weber wasn't just an overworked public defender. He was a skilled federal prosecutor who had been waiting months to play this role. Every fumbled paper, every dropped file had been carefully choreographed to make him seem harmless until this moment. That evening, Maya sat in her FBI team's secret office, watching surveillance footage of the aftermath. Plant and Reynolds had spent hours shredding documents in their precinct. Judge Harrison had made 3 separate trips to his bank. All of them had fallen into the trap, their panicked reactions only providing more evidence of their guilt. They'll try to cover it up, one of her team members said. Maya nodded, finally allowing herself a small smile. Let them try. Every move they make now will only dig them deeper. Sometimes the best way to catch corrupt people is to let them think they're winning, right until the moment they realize they've lost everything. The next morning, courtroom 4B was filled beyond capacity. Word had spread about yesterday's dramatic hearing, and now everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Maya Thompson sat quietly at the defense table, still wearing her nurse's scrubs. Officer Plant and Reynolds stood near the back doors, their faces tense. Judge Harrison entered, his usual confidence replaced by barely hidden concern. Before we continue with yesterday's evidence, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying a slight tremor. The court has received a motion to dismiss all charges based on lack of evidence. Maya watched as her clumsy lawyer, Weber, stood up. Gone was his crooked tie and messy paperwork. Today, he stood straight and professional, every inch the federal prosecutor he truly was. Your Honor, Weber said clearly, before you rule on that motion, the defense would like to introduce one final piece of evidence. Judge Harrison's hand tightened on his gavel. Make it quick, Mr. Weber. Weber nodded to Maya, who slowly stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce the court to my client's true identity. He pulled out an FBI badge. This is Special Agent Maya Thompson, lead investigator for the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Officer Plant's face went white. Reynolds grabbed for the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Federal agents had already quietly secured all exits. This is ridiculous. Judge Harrison sputtered, banging his gavel. I won't allow this theatrical. Actually, Your Honor. A new voice rang out. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, Maya's former fellow nurse, walked into the courtroom, followed by a team of FBI agents. This court is now under federal jurisdiction. Maya removed her simple silver necklace, holding up the sophisticated recording device it contained. For the past 6 months, I've documented every illegal action, every planted piece of evidence, every bribe accepted by this court. Officer Plant made a dash for the side door, but found 2 FBI agents waiting. Reynolds had already been handcuffed, his face showing the shock of someone who suddenly realized he'd been played. This is outrageous. Judge Harrison stood up, his face purple with rage. I am a federal judge. And I am a federal agent. Maya cut in, her voice strong and clear. One who has gathered extensive evidence of your participation in a criminal conspiracy to wrongfully convict innocent citizens. The hidden camera in her badge had been recording everything. Now, a court officer set up a projection screen, and Maya's team began playing selected clips. Plant and Reynolds planting drugs in her trunk. Judge Harrison discussing bribes in his chambers. Reynolds threatening previous victims. Offshore account numbers being exchanged. Conversations about targeting successful black women. Over the past 3 years, Maya announced to the stunned courtroom, your organization has wrongfully convicted 37 women. You destroyed their careers, their reputations, their lives. You thought you were untouchable. Weber stepped forward, now flanked by more federal agents. Richard Harrison, Michael Plant, James Reynolds, you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, evidence tampering, false imprisonment, and violation of civil rights under color of law. As federal agents moved to handcuff Judge Harrison, he stared at Maya with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You were just a nurse. Maya smiled for the first time since her arrest 2 weeks ago. That's exactly what you were supposed to think. Your biggest mistake was assuming that a successful black woman must be guilty of something. Your second biggest mistake was not realizing that we've been watching you for months. The courtroom had become a scene of organized chaos. FBI agents were securing evidence, reading rights, and handcuffing not just the judge and officers, but also court clerks and other police officers who had been part of the conspiracy. Through it all, Maya stood tall, finally dropping the scared nurse act she'd maintained for so long. As she watched Harrison, Plant, and Reynolds being led away in handcuffs, she thought about all the women they had wrongfully convicted. This was just the beginning. Her team would now begin the process of reviewing every case these corrupt officials had touched. Agent Thompson, Sarah Chen called from the doorway. The press is outside. Would you like to make a statement? Maya gathered her files, including the detailed evidence that would free dozens of innocent women. Yes, she said firmly. It's time to tell the whole story. It's time for justice to finally work the way it's supposed to. 2 weeks after the dramatic courthouse arrests, Maya Thompson sat in the FBI's field office, surrounded by walls covered in photos, documents, and connection maps. What had started as an investigation into 3 corrupt officials had exploded into something much bigger. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story hit the news. Agent Thompson, her assistant, called from the doorway. Another victim has come forward. Dr. Patricia Williams, convicted in 2022. Same pattern. Plant and Reynolds made the arrest. Harrison handled the case. Maya nodded, adding another photo to the wall. Dr. Williams had been a prominent surgeon before her arrest. Now she was serving 15 years in state prison. Add her file to the review pile, and get me the transcripts from her trial. The investigation had revealed a corruption network that went far beyond Harrison City. Maya's team had uncovered similar patterns in 3 neighboring counties. The same offshore accounts that had received Judge Harrison's bribes had also made payments to 2 other judges, 4 police captains, and even a state prosecutor. The money trail goes back 12 years, FBI forensic accountant James Chen explained, spreading financial documents across Maya's desk. We've identified over $20 million in bribes, all carefully hidden through shell companies and fake business investments. Maya studied the documents, her trained eye catching details others might miss. Look at these dates, she pointed out. Every major payment corresponds to a high-profile arrest of a successful black woman. They weren't just corrupt, they were specifically targeting women who had beaten the odds and achieved success. Down the hall, in a large conference room, former victims gathered daily to share their stories. Lisa Jackson, the cardiologist Maya had mentioned at the hospital, was there. So was Angela Baker, the bank manager, and dozens of others. Each story followed the same pattern: a successful career destroyed by planted evidence and rushed convictions. We found evidence of judicial misconduct in over 300 cases, Sarah Chen reported, now openly working as a federal prosecutor. Judge Harrison was manipulating evidence, pressuring witnesses, and fast-tracking convictions. The entire system was rigged. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her undercover team. They just arrested 2 more police officers who had worked with Plant and Reynolds. The officers were already talking, hoping to make deals. Each new arrest led to more revelations, more names, more corrupt officials. The State Bar Association is reviewing every lawyer involved in these cases, Weber announced, walking in with a fresh stack of files. They've already suspended 3 prosecutors who worked closely with Harrison. 2 of them are cooperating with our investigation. The corruption had spread like a cancer through the justice system. Maya's team discovered that Harrison and his conspirators had developed a sophisticated system for identifying potential targets. They looked for black women who had achieved prominence in their fields: doctors, lawyers, executives, educators. The more successful the woman, the more likely she was to be targeted. They saw successful black women as threats, Maya explained to her team during their evening briefing. Each conviction sent a message: stay in your place, or this could happen to you. But now the tables had turned. Every day brought new evidence, new witnesses, new cooperating defendants eager to save themselves by exposing others. The corrupt network was falling apart. In the prison visitation room, Maya interviewed Judge Harrison one last time. The once powerful judge now wore an orange jumpsuit, his arrogance replaced by desperate anger. "You've destroyed everything," he spat at her. Maya leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "No, Judge Harrison, you destroyed lives. You used your power to punish innocent women for their success. I'm just making sure justice finally works the way it should." As she left the prison, Maya received another update. The governor had just announced a special commission to review every case handled by Harrison and his corrupt network. Preliminary findings suggested that over 400 convictions might need to be overturned. Back in her office, Maya added more photos to the wall: women whose lives had been destroyed by corruption but who would soon taste freedom again. Dr. Williams would be released next week. Angela Baker had already been cleared and was planning to sue the city. Lisa Jackson would get her medical license back. "It's not just about catching the bad guys," Maya told her team as they prepared to serve another round of warrants. "It's about fixing a broken system. Every corrupt officer we arrest, every crooked judge we expose, brings us one step closer to real justice. And we're just getting started." 6 months after the dramatic courthouse arrests, Maya Thompson stood on the same steps where she had once been led away in handcuffs. This time, she wore her FBI badge openly as she watched Judge Harrison, officers Plant and Reynolds, and 9 other corrupt officials being escorted to prison transport vehicles. The morning sun caught the metal of their handcuffs, a fitting symbol of justice finally served. "All rise," called the bailiff in the federal courtroom earlier that morning. The jury had taken just 4 hours to reach their verdict: guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison had received 30 years. Plant and Reynolds each got 25. Their corrupt empire had crumbled completely. But for Maya, the real victory wasn't just putting corrupt officials behind bars. It was watching the women they had wrongfully convicted walking free. Dr. Lisa Jackson had performed her first surgery since being reinstated at Memorial Hospital. Angela Baker was now running her own bank. Each woman they had tried to destroy was rising again, stronger than before. "Agent Thompson," called a voice. Maya turned to see Patricia Williams, the former surgeon she'd helped free, running up the courthouse steps, I just finished my first week back at work. The hospital board cleared me completely. Maya hugged her, remembering how Dr. Williams had looked in prison just months ago. Now she stood tall, confident again, her medical license restored and her reputation cleared. How does it feel to be back in the operating room? Like coming home, Patricia smiled, happy tears in her eyes. My first patient was a young girl who wants to be a doctor. I told her about you, about how one person can change the whole system if they're brave enough. Reporters gathered around as more former victims arrived. Each had a story of renewal, of rebuilding what corruption had tried to destroy. Maya's investigation had led to 412 convictions being overturned. The state had already paid out millions in compensation, with more cases pending. Agent Thompson, a young reporter, called out, "What's next for your task force?" Maya stepped up to the microphones. Behind her stood her entire team, Sarah Chen, Weber, and dozens of FBI agents who had worked tirelessly to expose the truth. But more importantly, beside her stood the women who had survived the corrupt system's worst attacks. "Today isn't the end," Maya announced clearly. "It's a beginning. We've created a new civil rights enforcement division, staffed by some of the very women who were wrongfully convicted. Who better to spot corruption than those who survived it?" She gestured to the group behind her. "Dr. Jackson will lead our medical investigations unit. Ms. Baker is training our financial crimes team. Every woman here brings unique expertise and an unwavering commitment to justice. We're not just fighting corruption, we're changing how the system works." The changes were already visible. The governor had appointed a reform commission led by formerly incarcerated women. Police departments across the state were undergoing mandatory bias training. A new oversight board, independent of the judicial system, would review any case where discrimination was suspected. As the crowd dispersed, Maya walked through the courthouse halls one last time. The building felt different now, cleaner, more hopeful. In Judge Harrison's former courtroom, a new judge was being sworn in. Judge Michelle Carter, an African-American woman who had spent 20 years defending civil rights. "Ready for your new assignment?" Sarah Chen asked, joining Maya by the window. Maya nodded, watching as more corrupt officials were led out to waiting vehicles. "We've already received requests from 3 other states to investigate similar patterns. This was never just about Harrison City." That evening, Maya visited the FBI Training Academy, where she now taught a special course on corruption investigations. Her students included women from all backgrounds, each determined to protect the justice system from those who would abuse it. The most dangerous corrupt officials, Maya told her class, are the ones who think they're untouchable. They target people they think won't fight back, won't be believed. Our job is to prove them wrong. She looked out at the eager faces before her and saw the future. A justice system protected by people who understood both its power and its responsibility. The corrupt judge and officers had never expected her to be an FBI agent. Now, thanks to their own arrogance, they had helped create an army of investigators determined to follow in her footsteps. "Remember," Maya concluded, "true justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent, restoring what was stolen, and making sure the system works for everyone, not just those with power. That's the lesson we learned, and that's the legacy we'll build together." The sun set over the courthouse, its light catching the words carved above the entrance. "Equal justice under law." For the first time in years, Maya believed those words might finally be true.